Good morning, good morning, good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We're here for our monthly installation of disruptive discussions. Many of you have been with us on our monthly webinars, where we really seek to uncover some truths, whether they are easy to absorb or harder to understand. The concepts and how it impacts our lives today is what's really important to us. So again, my name is Geraldine Swift. I'm the Chief Empowerment Officer of Premier Organizational Designs. I'm a DEI strategist, a coach, a trainer, an author, and a public speaker. We have been DEI practitioners for over 30 years, but in the past 30 years, diversity concepts have changed because we're focusing a lot on inclusion, equity, access, and justice. So in our monthly discussions, we try to bring you topics that really help to expand your thinking around diversity, equity, and inclusion. We bring you topics that are meant to change your hearts and your minds. And we have a really powerful topic that we're going to discuss today. Before we jump in, because we have a powerhouse guest speaker with us today that we're really excited about. But before we jump in, I do want to mention that we also have one of our panelists who is going to join us today, Dr. Adrienne Dixon, and she's in New Orleans. So of course, we know what's going on in New Orleans, and she's not able to join us today. So if you can say words of prayer or words of comfort in your heart for all of our brothers and sisters in New Orleans and what they're dealing with the hurricane, we truly appreciate it. We know that they need our support. So before I introduce our guest today, let me tee up the topic because it's been heavily talked about and debated recently, especially in the media and throughout various school systems, and that is critical race theory. We have the distinct pleasure today of having with us Dr. Janet Dewart Bell, President, founder of InterGenerational Solutions. She has a Ph.D. in leadership and change from Antioch University. Dr. Bell is an author, a consultant, a professor, and a public speaker. She has written penetrating essays on race and social stratification within policing and the law in honor of her late husband, Professor Derrick Bell, a legal scholar, a professor at Harvard Law School, the former dean of law at the University of Oregon, where he was one of the first African-American deans of a non-Black university, and professor at New York University School of Law, and a founding pioneer of critical race theory. We'll put it in the chat box, but I'm telling you, if you're looking for an education, you will want to grab some of her literary works, Race, Rights and Redemption, the Derrick Bell Lectures on the Law and Critical Race Theory, or Lighting the Fires of Freedom, African-American Women in the Civil Rights Movement, or any other literary masterpieces she has written. So it's true, it's true. So I simply want to just first thank you, Dr. Bell, for agreeing to join us today and to share your wisdom and your insights. You have a perspective that many of us might not have, even those of us in the DEI field who have studied to some degree critical race theory. But we don't have the level of wisdom that you have because you were right there when these concepts and these structures were being put in place. So let's first talk about, if you don't mind, I'd like to ask you about the origin of critical race theory, because with the recent negative attention that we've had about the concept and people discussing race at an academic level, it has come up more and more, and it's been under attack. And I hear a lot of misconceptions about it from all ethnicities, especially about its origin. So can you share with us so that a lay person would understand what critical race theory is and why it came about?
Okay, well, thank you so much for that kind introduction. And I have to say, meeting you has just been one of the highlights of your enthusiasm and your wanting to further the conversation, even if the conversations may be uncomfortable, but to
Yes.
have enlightenment and your sense of humanity and love for everybody. So
Thank
I'm
you so much.
I'm glad to be part of this. I always say I am not an expert on critical race theory. But I know enough. I have a layperson's understanding and explanation of it. And I'll get to that in a moment with a very short slide presentation. What I usually do is I refer to the people the academic scholars, because critical race theory really came about because the first African-American professors, particularly at white law schools like Harvard Law and others, they noticed that civil rights law and laws that dealt with the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment, things like that, were really seen through the eyes of white professors who constantly quoted themselves and created a dialogue that did not particularly include the views, the opinions, the depth of understanding of African Americans. And so a group of people, not only African Americans, you had people like Gary Peller, you had um, um, obviously Kimberly Crenshaw, who organized a conference at Harvard, Kendall Thomas. There are a lot of people who started as an academic pursuit. They did not foresee, I don't think, that critical race theory would in 2021 be weaponized as something to criticize, to attack the history of Black people. So I think critical race theory is just part of uh, really dealing with what our history as a country, as a nation is. So if we could go to the slide, I'd like to start with that, and then we can go back. And so this is a little slide I put together, especially for you and your audience, Darylyn.
Thank you. Thank you.
This is new, so this is the premiere of this presentation. So this is talking about critical race theory. And so I reduced it to 4 essential components. And maybe if I found my glasses, I actually could read it. The first spoke there is that defending democracy through truth and reconciliation. I'll read all of them and then I'll take them one by one. So then I say history and facts matter, confronting the big lies and the orchestrated fear factor, and taking responsibility and moving forward as one nation. Now let's deconstruct these. Let's take these one by one. So defending democracy through truth and reconciliation. It's amazing that people don't want us to know our history. And as you know the quote, those who do not know their history are, quote, doomed to repeat it.
Right.
Or do not know how glorious their history was. They do not know about the pyramids that were built. They do not know about papyrus. They do not know about the culture that Black folks had created over the centuries. So you really must know your history. But defending democracy through truth and reconciliation, South Africa, which we know went through apartheid, all this sort of stuff. But when it became the Republic of South Africa, when you had a multiracial government, thank goodness for Nelson Mandela, that the African National Congress wanted to say, well, look, let's sort of put history the way we want to interpret, and people like Bishop Tutu said, no. What we must do is we must tell the truth. Mm-hmm. There is glory, there is gore, there's on all sides. For us to really move forward as a nation, we must tell the truth. Nazi Germany, Germany was one of the most cultured countries in the world. I always think of it as the land of one of my favorite authors, Goethe. And so I think of it, how did Germany get this way? But now you cannot go to Berlin without seeing evidence of the horrors of the Holocaust.
Right.
People have to confront that. But what we're seeing in this country are people who want to erase our history. They want to say, or to create a false narrative. All this stuff about Confederate statues, for example, those statues were not something that were done in like the 1800s. Those were done, many of those were done in response to the civil rights movement. So it was like in your face gestures to say, okay, you folks think you're advancing, but we're going to keep Robert E. Lee and we're going to do that, even though they fought against the Union. And speaking of that, when you look at the January 6th insurrection at our nation's capital, people were walking through the halls of Congress carrying Confederate flags and then using American flags as weapons to attack police and who would have attacked members of Congress if they were able to get through that door that courageous Capitol Police officer, Michael Byrd, stopped them from doing. So we have to talk. So if we want to move forward, we have to talk about the truth and reconciliation and know that we're not all saints and we're not all sinners, but we are human beings, and how do we move forward? So history and facts do matter.
Yes.
For our history that people are trying to erase, this particularly in some states headed by, and I'm saying this is nonpartisan, we're all nonpartisan, I understand that. And my comments, while I'm the founder and president of Lead InterGenerational Solutions, these are my comments, that I'm
right.
Dr. Janet Dewart Bell, Ph.D. And so history and facts matter. So when people want to say, well, let's get rid of 1619 project, why is that? What are you so afraid of? Why are you afraid to tell the truth, to tell the story of our history? When Michelle Obama said that she wakes up every day in a house built by slaves, white supremacists went crazy. And why is that? It was the truth. So that matters. They were built by slaves who are uncompensated, who are not treated properly, who are treated as less than human beings, but who had the skills, the ability to build that kind of structure. And speaking of history and facts, you look at our history where we are not included. When you talk about, okay, let's explore Alaska. Well, what happened to Matthew Perry in our history books? So when you want to talk about the laying out of Washington, D.C., they want to talk about Pierre L'Enfant. They don't want to talk about the other people who actually helped Pierre L'Enfant lay out Washington, D.C. So it's how people want to erase the history of not just Black people, but Indigenous people. I was talking to someone at a university, in a Western university, and a student wanted to raise the issue of Indigenous people and what happened to them. If you listen to some of the conservative, I call them far right-wing commentators, you would think that all of a sudden, in some mystical time in a land far, far away, that this country was somehow built by white folks who came over, and that was it. And this is quote, and that is their country. That is theirs to keep. Well, that is so far from the truth. There were people here before others came here, our Indigenous brothers and sisters. In fact, I'm so ignorant, and I guess I'm one of those flag wavers. I grew up and I was raised in Erie, Pennsylvania, and I love this country. And and when I first heard the phrase "Make America Great Again," I first thought, oh, they must be talking about the Choctaws, the Apaches,
right.
I was totally confused. And I said, oh no, what they're doing is they're distorting that. There were people here before people came. And so history and facts matter, and we must tell the truth. We must tell the story. For example, people say that the history of, quote, race riots were mostly situations in which Black people, when I'm talking about Black, quote, race riots, were doing well. Tulsa, for instance. Tulsa was called Black Wall Street because people were so prosperous, and some people chose to destroy that. And so that has been part of the history of our country. Speaking of the history, to me, those who are the beneficiaries of the white supremacist doctrines are a very narrow part of people who control certain elements of our society, the economy, or what have you, and they disrespect the people they purport to represent, like poor people who, but for the color of their skin, have more in common with most people of color than they do with the top 1%. But while the top 1% are eating steak, what they feed to their foot soldiers is Jim Crow. That's all they have. Cheryl Harris, Professor Cheryl Harris at UCLA, talks about it, the property right in whiteness. So they won't give them, so they disrespect them. They ignore the humanity of people they are supposed to represent. And what they give them is this false sense of superiority. Well, my mother always said, anyone who thinks they're superior to anyone else has proven that they are not. Mm-hmm. So I want to confront the big lies and the orchestrated fear factor. Why are people afraid, so afraid? You know, they're afraid that if people, for example, understand what the history is, they will do to Black people what has been done to us. And that's simply not the way we have been raised. We have been raised as loving people, to accept people, and to really have a sense of community, although a lot of that has been orchestrated to be destroyed in our own community. But the fear factor is such that people think, I think this is that people are so afraid of that they cannot get beyond their own particular fears, that people will rise up against them. Well, that's not happening. It has not happened. You know, you have the example of a John Lewis who is beaten, his head, his skull cracked, beaten to within an inch of his life. And when a person came up to him decades later and said, I'm one of the people who beat you on that bridge, and said, will you forgive me? John Lewis said, yes, I forgive you. Mm-hmm. Well, most of us are not that good. Right. People can aspire to be as good as John Lewis. And let's pass that Voting Rights Act, people. So, okay, so what I say, so people say, oh, well, all that slavery stuff, that was in the past. So, you know, it's not my responsibility. What they do is that they deny the fact that they are the beneficiaries of the unpaid labor of indigenous people, of African slaves who were brought here. And the other thing too, and so they don't want to take responsibility. So I say, I'm not blaming you. You know, I'm a peace and love, brothers and sisters kind of person, you know? And so I'm not blaming you for the past, but I'm saying we are now in the present. What are you going to do? When you get to St. Peter, what are you going to say on your ledger? Okay, I denied health care to low-income people. I did, what kinds of things are you going to say? So the next slide is taking responsibility and moving forward as one nation. And that is really what we need to do. So that I'll stop there. But those are the main points that I want to raise. That's my non-legal interpretation of what critical race theory is. I want to thank Renee Floyd Myers for those dynamic graphics, and we will make those available to your audience as you wish.
Thank you very much. That was a powerful way to bring what critical race theory is and to really make it where we can understand the difference between the history that we're being fed and looking at the truth in history. And I'll tell you, when you brought up Germany, a couple of years ago, my daughter and son-in-law took my grandson, who might have been 11 at the time, and took him to some concentration camps in Germany. And what was really interesting is that's one of the ways that they have decided to educate him is by sharing with him the truths about history. And when we were in the concentration camps, I had the privilege of going with them. One of the plaques on the wall said just that. We are educating and telling the truth about our history to one, acknowledge the atrocities that we as a country stood for so that we don't repeat them and so that we can uncover the humanistic piece of our lives and that society should live up under. And so that was really something that made me think about that when you mentioned that. Now, I want to just ask another question because there's
say something about that because
yes, absolutely.
I've been to Germany about 10 times and I'm always impressed. I'm impressed with that. And the other thing is that I also taught in Morocco and Tunisia. And the thing that I try to lift up with that experience that in Morocco and Tunisia is that they pointed out to me the Jewish sectors of towns. And they also pointed out to me that they accepted Jewish refugees when the United States of America turned the boats back. And they don't understand why people don't know that and why people don't appreciate that. So I try to lift that up whenever I can, because I always think that's the indomitable human spirit. That's we know that we can overcome our circumstances, that if all we have to do is really be human, and we take that as our basic guiding light, and that's how we move forward.
Absolutely, absolutely. But you know, there's a lot of critics of critical race theory. They force us to have a critical, examination of systemic racism in America. But there's many that say that having these conversations, and the more that we talk about race and racism, the more that it really divides us instead of pulls us together. Can you tell me, and you kind of mentioned it in your discussion, but do you have any ideas of why, number one, people just don't want to talk about race or racism? Is it because they're going to have to own it, or because they're going to have to do something about it? Is it because of what Brene Brown talks about, guilt and shame? Like, what are your thoughts about the why people want to use critical race theory right now? You said it's been weaponized. Why is it people want to use critical race theory right now as a means to stop the conversations of the legal history of racism in the United States?
Well, I think what you said, there's absolute truth in what you said. And I'm going to tell you a little secret.
Okay, I'm listening.
This is the secret. Derrick Bell, when I would introduce him from time to time, I would say, play on the Iceman company. I would say the race man is coming, because Derrick really wanted to further the conversation about race. His case book, Race, Racism, and American Law, which is in law schools across the country, which he did when he was at Harvard, really is a fantastic document, and talks about the history of race. But Derrick, as with I, said, race is a social construct.
Right.
If we could, we would not talk about it. I'm 75 years old. Really, what I would rather be doing is sitting on my porch drinking champagne. But y'all aren't letting that happen. Because we have people who want to push the conversation, who have figured out they are really good at this. The propagandists being able to turn what should be a good thing into something that people think is negative, and we don't want to talk about it. Well, you must talk about it. I mean, how are you raising your children? Are you saying, okay, we have a problem here, but the best thing we're going to do is sweep it under the rug, and we're never going to talk about it because we never want to come up with a solution? Critical race theorists are solution oriented. They're not just, talking about the past. They're saying, how do we look at what our history is? And the humanity with which they talk about the history is really extraordinary. But for some reason, someone got in a room with a cauldron or something and got these white supremacists together, and they said, let us figure out how we can destroy what should be a positive thing. And so the conversations are uncomfortable, and they're uncomfortable for me sometimes, but I don't have a choice. I feel I have a calling to talk about it and to say it. And I say you have to have an open mind, a clear eye, and also an open heart.
Absolutely.
My heart starts with loving everybody. My open heart starts with being brought up by my mother, Willa Mae Neal, born poor in rural Arkansas, for whom she never met a person who was not beautiful. She found the beauty in everyone. I try to do that. I have to admit, I don't quite do it. Willa Mae Neal did that. I didn't do that. I'm working on it. Maybe I have a few more years to talk about it. And
we're all a work in progress.
We're all a work in progress. But what she also said was, and I say this when I speak particularly to young people, and somehow this resonates with them. My mother said, you are, as this was her, she had an 8th grade education formally, but she was self-educated. She was the smartest person I ever knew. She spent most of her life working as a household worker, a maid, and doing other kinds of service work, all of which is honorable work. But had she had the opportunity to be educated, she would have been an architect.
Okay.
And so that was it. But my mother would come up with these gems. And one thing that she said, when she just instilled it in us, you are as good as anybody.
That's right.
But you are no better than anybody else.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Work is in progress.
And we all are until we're no longer here. There's something that when you were talking about race as a social construct, that's, I'm a DEI trainer, and that's something that we teach. And it's kind of hard for people to grasp that concept, that it's a social construct. So sometimes I take them back to like Linnaeus in the 1700s, and I take them back to the classification of man that came about. Even though he did not use the term race, he did have this classification, and this was taught and embedded into the hearts and minds of people who were considered the leaders of this country. And when you think about how that trickles down into our belief systems, even the belief systems of the people that he considered at the bottom of the classification. So of course he started off with Europeans being the highest in intellect, in power, in every way, then European Americans, then Asians, and then Africans. And so when you think about how that mentality was embedded into our society, which elevated our white brothers and sisters, and it minimized the contributions of especially our African brothers and sisters, then you see the trickle-down effect today. And unless you go back, you said history matters, unless you kind of go back to the understanding that race is a social construct and kind of where that concept came about, you won't understand the impact it has today. So I thank you for bringing that up.
Well, Derrick had an alter ego, a female character in his trade press books, Geneva Crenshaw. And there was one exchange where Geneva Crenshaw was talking to one of the founding fathers, and she was talking as forcefully as she could. She was a tall, very forceful Black woman. I always think of her somewhat like Sojourner Truth. Well, those of you who know me, that I'm not very tall. I'm more like my mother and my grandmother, but one of the exchanges she has, as she was really giving the business and speaking truth to power, the founding father said, and how do you, a Black woman, have the audacity
right
to say that? And so we have the audacity, and we must speak truth to power. So, it's very interesting about this social construct thing. And so then when you say, why are we so different? We are more, if we would accept it, we are more alike than different. And talk about the power of language. So I have been trying to figure out a way, since I've been dealing with communications for about 60 years or something. I've been trying to figure out how language privileges certain people. So what I've been trying to say is that people of color and not people of color. Don't say the others that most people say. And so I try to say, rather than gay and straight, I say gay and not gay, because see how there's a subtle difference in language, how that privileges people in power. So you really have to be careful about how you use language. And I understand that, and like you say, works in progress. I am so far, I'm always a work in progress. So please bear with me, folks, because I'm always trying to figure out how we can communicate this, how we can communicate our social justice message better, how it can be more inclusive, how we cannot eliminate people. And the other thing too that I try to say, and this is what I tell people, is that know your own biases and your prejudices.
Absolutely.
When I teach, the first day of class, I say, this is who I am. These are my biases. And I also say, but you are not graded by whether you agree with me or not, and my biases. You are graded by if what you present, you back it up with a strong argument, with whatever the quote facts are, and that you write it in a way that's compelling and persuasive. And I have to admit, a few students at the beginning are like, yeah, okay, she's saying it, she isn't doing it. So I had this guy who was, I don't know who he is, because, teaching on Zoom, students in my school, Baruch, are not, you cannot require them to turn on their video. So they're I have never seen. And this guy, knowing that I am so anti-death penalty, there is no such thing as a good death penalty sentence, as far as I'm concerned. He would introduce himself when he would comment, as the death penalty guy to get a rise out of me. Well, he was an excellent student, got his A. But it was really kind of funny, because the students will push you, and that they do that. So Derrick always said that trust students first, because his protests at Harvard and at the University of Oregon, where he gave up tenure at Harvard. I mean, what person gives up tenure?
Gives up tenure at Harvard.
I mean, really? Is really to support the students, because in the Bell household, it is always students first. Whether we agree with the students or not, our default position is to support our students and to give them a chance to grow, to do like we did, to make mistakes, to fail.
Absolutely.
But it's students first.
Absolutely. And you bringing up students is a great segue to my next point, but I want to make a comment based on something you said before, and then someone put in the chat how powerful words are. And I love the fact that you say people of color, non-people of color. We also, with my team, we have gotten rid of the minority majority language. So we don't say that you're majority or minority anymore. We might talk about being represented or underrepresented. And we got that language from a friend of mine, former colleague, Marco Lindsay at UC Berkeley, Haas School of Business, because that's how he refers to it. But there's other language that we can use that doesn't minimize the existence of any group of people. I tell people all the time, there's nothing minor about me for me to be considered a minority, number one. Number two, if you look at the numbers, people of color are not a minority. But because the dominant culture, what has been the dominant culture has led the creation of the systems and the laws and the policies and guidelines to a point that it benefits them, we've been fed to believe that we're a minority and we don't have a voice that we should be using. So yes, language and words matter, and they're very powerful.
Well, before when I referred to the fact that we have to check our own biases and things like that, I grew up in Erie, Pennsylvania, and my family virtually integrated the county schools. My older brother, 5 years older than I, was the first known Black student. I say that because some of y'all were passing then, and I don't
Right.
that because that's the way the society was. So, but I have to check myself out, because I want to make sure that those biases, we are all trained with the song from South Pacific, you've got to be taught to be afraid of people whose eyes are oddly made, and people whose skin is a different shade. You've got to be carefully taught. So we are all taught biases.
Yes. Yes.
Do is figure out what that is that we have been taught, and deconstruct it and just move on from that. And it obviously, all of this is harder than to talk about it, but that must be our commitment. Because I grew up thinking that, I grew up in a school, I was only one or two Black people in the class, and they were telling me stuff like slaves did not rebel. They were happy out there in that cotton
I've heard that.
120-degree heat. I'm going like, wait a minute. So I went to visit my grandmother in rural Arkansas, and I begged her to let me go out with her. She and my grandfather, beautiful man, beautiful people. I begged them to let me go out in the cotton field with them and pick cotton one day. They said, child, you're from Erie, Pennsylvania. You don't have the hands, there's nothing you can do. So they let me go out. Well, of course, I barely made it through the day because of hard work. So people out there in the heat, which would be the equivalent of like 110, 120 degrees. So my grandmother, all 4'11", could fill up a 100-pound bag of cotton and drag it in. They had 35 acres, as I say. They never had that promised 40 acres and a mule. So they also were sharecroppers. And so that's the stock I come from. And I want to lift up the work, the legacy of people like that.
Absolutely. And those are the stories we need to hear more about, because people think it's so far in the past that we don't need to bring those up in conversations, or that they don't impact us today. And I will tell you, when you tell that story, it makes me think of, I recently was with my 85-year-old father in Texas, and I'm starting to capture some of his stories on video. And he literally just about 3 weeks ago was telling me the difference between picking cotton and pulling cotton. Now he's 85.
Chopping, yes. Cotton, girl, chopping.
Yes. So he's 85, and we have people still living today that had to pick and pull cotton, not because they were slaves necessarily, but that was the only type of work that they could get. And thank goodness he was able to, go to school and get his education. And I'm not sure his Ph.D. is in some type of counseling, but he was able to create a life of his own. But he talks about his mother and the scars on her back from when she didn't perform the way that the people who were running these cotton picking industries, when she didn't perform the way that they felt she should, and that beating was the punishment, not necessarily lack of money or not paying them, but that people were still being beaten. And this is after slavery has occurred or has officially ended. So those are the types of stories we need to talk about.
Well, that when people now go to Michelle Alexander's great book, the New Jim Crow, talking about the mass incarceration. But after slavery, speaking about knowing your history, these people don't want us to remember this. Some people don't want us to remember. Others are genuinely ignorant. Then there are others who I call are willfully ignorant, and then there are others who try to perpetuate ignorance, lack of.
Right.
So what happened was, after slavery, and they criminalize what would be normal behavior so that they could get free labor on those chain gangs. And so with different kinds of transformation, that's really what continued, and it has continued over the centuries, over the decades. And so we have to look at that. Why is that there's a disproportionate number of people, particularly African American males, who are incarcerated? Their crimes are not worse than other people's crimes.
Right.
Punishment is worse than other people's punishment. And that has such a snowballing effect. So if you have the lack of Black men in society, and you have disruption of families, you have the disruption of what should be partnerships, you have the disruption, you have economic destruction, because many places, that if there's a big difference between a 2-income household and a 1-income household. And so to incarcerate Black men at the rate that this country has been doing really has had a very deep, insidious effect on the Black community. And so we have to understand that and overcome that. And when we try to speak about it, we get such comments like, "Oh, you know who said it? Shut up and dribble." It's kind of
right. And so that takes me to the last question, and then I want to give you time. I want you to talk about your book in a minute, but before we get to your book, I want to just ask you one last question. So there's so much opposition to critical race theory and the concept of it being taught in the schools. Do you think critical race theory should be taught in the schools? I know that was not its original intent, but do you think there is any value? Do you think there is value, and what is the value of teaching critical race theory in the schools?
Well, I don't think it should necessarily be taught as critical race theory. I think it should be talking about as a full exploration of American history. And if the academics like me and others want to call it critical race theory, fine. And then I have to say that the politicians who are trying to do the right thing, we have to confront this distortion of critical race theory head on. But there's school systems now who are trying to ban books. In Tennessee, they're trying to ban books by Ruby Bridges, of all people. Now, Ruby is not like I am. I have to admit, I'm nonpartisan when it comes to lead, but I'm a very political person. I'm an outspoken person. Ruby Bridges is all about just loving your neighbor and 10 commandments and all this kind of stuff. People want to ban her book. They want to ban, in Texas, they want to ban the mention of Frederick Douglass. Who else would they? I mean, there are all these people that it simply makes no sense. So what we have to be aware of, so for every step forward, so I'm glad that the president said Juneteenth, let's make that a holiday. But immediately, other people, not immediately, because they've been doing it for decades, there's this sub rosa culture that many of us did not pay attention to. And that rosa culture that is so bent on preserving their the idea of white supremacy, that they will do anything to undermine the progress of humanity. And I keep saying, well, exactly what is their end game? What do they think is going to happen if you deny the truth of our existence and our mutuality? So that's on them. Now people ask me that question. I said, well, you ask them, what is their end game? Why does Mitch McConnell say, he said for Obama, I'm not going to support any of his legislation, especially his Supreme Court appointments. Same thing with Joe Biden. So Derrick talked about interest convergence. We are at interest convergence. So white folks need to understand that even though we may have, what's the saying that we may be the canary in the mine, but eventually it gets to them. You cannot run away from this. You cannot escape this. If you are silent, silence is your own destruction. Silence is your own death. It's like that poem by the great minister, and then they came for me, and then they came for me. After a while, when they when they come for all these other people, and those people are no longer there, who's going to speak for you? Well, one last thing, I love the old movies. I'm not a big fan of all of these fantasy things, but there's a great movie called The Garden of the Finzi Continis, which was from the 60s or 70s. And what's that? This Italian Jewish family lived behind their gated community, and they were fine in the rise of Mussolini, in Italy, and Nazi Germany, Hitler, Nazi Germany. It's like, it didn't affect me. I mean, we're
right.
Above that. We are the talented 10th. We are the exception until we're not.
Until we're not. Absolutely. And we're seeing some of that today, even with the COVID-19 and the rise of, hate against some of our Asian brothers and sisters, and the move toward Stop Asian Hate. There's been a conversation about the support, because there's intercultural support that needs to happen. But many people have said, but where were you when we were fighting with Black Lives Matter? And so it's starting a conversation.
Well, I always say with Dr. Martin Luther, I try to quote Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King: injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere.
And that's why this fight, it doesn't belong to any specific culture or ethnicity of people. It belongs to all of us. So in a way, it's been good that we're having that conversation of, okay, how can we support each other? Because we don't have to be siloed in this fight against racial injustice. So I wanted to we're going over time a little bit because the conversation has been so powerful, but I do want to start to wrap it up. Any final words that you want to share with us? And then I'm going to give a chance for maybe 2 questions. So if you're in the audience and you have a question, please put it in the chat box. Carla will share it with us. But before we take questions, Dr. Bell, are there any words that you want to leave us with? Any thoughts you want to leave us with?
Just do the best you can. And usually it's more than what you think it is. But we are on this earth, in this world, for a purpose. And the other thing that I share with my students, and I said they don't have to follow this too, I'm a religious nut. And I really do believe, I believe in a higher being. And I believe that we have a purpose. And I believe that we need to do what we can to make sure, to treat our brothers and sisters as we would ourselves. I sometimes say that if somebody were to take a poll and they were going to a crowd and they would take one of the 10 commandments, maybe not the first 2 because they're too obvious, but one of the lesser ones, and say, Obama said this, there'd be a certain group of people say, oh no, because Obama said,
because of, right.
They thought Obama said, well, no. And then there's someone from the Mount, and then they're all these things that you can point out that really are, these are commandments. These are not suggestions or what have you. These are things that we should be thinking about, living by, and trying to aspire to. So the things I would leave people with is that, we are not required to be perfect. Perfect. We are required. Our expectation is that we do the best we can. And we do it, as I said earlier, with open eyes, open mind, and open heart.
I love it. I love it. Thank you, thank you, thank you. We're about to take two questions, Carla, in just 1 second, but I wanted to mention when you said because Obama said it, it reminds me of something on YouTube where a guy was going around, a gentleman was going around interviewing people about the difference between Obamacare and the Affordable Care Act.
Right.
And they, right, did you see that? And they had negative things to say about Obamacare, but they were able to specifically lift up Affordable Care Act. And it was really interesting to see that level of, I'll just say, misunderstanding. I'll leave it at that.
That's a very kind way to say it.
I'm being kind. I'm being kind. Carla.
Kindness never is never bad. That's good.
Right. Carla, do we have just two questions of Dr. Bell? And I know I saw one question about her book. So if we can save that for the second question.
Sure. We do have a few questions. One that's interesting is, Dr. Bell, what is your response about the increasing media presence of Blacks or African Americans who are quoted as being against critical race theory?
My first reaction is that that's being manipulated, and that really doesn't represent the most of the people in the field. You know, I have the same feeling about them as I do about the few Black people you see at MAGA rallies, and you wonder where
Right.
so my feeling is that they are. I will go with the kind Daryl and Swift term that they have misunderstood what it is. And also they may be afraid, you know, part of the thing is the fear factor, you know, that people don't want to be associated with something that they might think would put them in harm's way. But, you know, I've lived here so long, and I walked with and I lived and I walked with a giant. You know, we live our life openly. So I'm not afraid that I'm like Michael Bird. I'll repeat him. You know, here's my name. You know where I live. I'm not afraid. God is on my side, and what I'm going to do is the best. But I understand why people are afraid, and they do not. They do not take a position of, I would say, of courage or of strength. And I wish they would, but I try to be more understanding of them, only because I have a couple of friends who are much nicer than I am. And they told me that sometimes that my opinions have been too harsh, and I just need to be more understanding of people who are not there yet. And I have prayed. And so when I pray, you know, when you pray in church, you know, for forgiveness, and that silent prayer, it's one of the things I pray for.
That's what you pray for. All right, Carla, another question, and then we'll wrap it up.
Okay, so we do have another question about our youth. So a participant asks, what can parents with children in counties that have banned critical race theory do to educate their children at home on the topics that would normally be covered under CRT?
Well, I think, you know, the thing that's the amazing about the internet, there's a lot of bad stuff out there, but it's also a lot of good stuff there. And there's many resources. And in fact, this is a question that I have been asked in certain forums. And so what we'll probably do is a little primer for teaching children our history, you know, sort of not trying to reinvent the wheel, but the 1619 project is a little bit too, maybe a little bit too sophisticated for some people, but, you know, just acquaint them with the literature, acquaint them with the stories by Ruby Bridges, acquaint them with books by, most children, they can deal with James Baldwin, Langston Hughes, Toni Morrison. Alice Walker may be a little tough for people. I love Alice Walker, but, you know, there's a lot of literature out there that might introduce people to discussions of race. And then there are also some, and Daryl and Swift may know about this, there are also some programs that have been done mostly for adults, but some of those can be adapted, I think, to younger people. So that's really good. You know, we are not inhibited by what the schools do or do not teach now. You know, I was lucky enough, even though I my family integrated the school system, I was lucky enough to have teachers who understood that a complete discussion of literature included, I was taught Langston Hughes by an Italian American. I mean, that's how I knew about the great black writers, of the Harlem Renaissance. And so, there's the literature out there, and literature is a good way to start, I think.
It is. And there's so many new resources that are out there that teach true history. And I'm thinking of Will Smith has a documentary, I guess, on Netflix now, and it's about the 14th Amendment. And even having your children sit down and watch these Netflix specials that have truth about our history, truth about these amendments and who they were really to protect, because it might not be the protection that you thought it was meant to be. So those are really good. Also, we do have, and Carla and Megan just remind me when we finish today, we do have almost a I don't know what you call it, a whiteboard animation about the legal history of racism that you can kind of follow the timeline of it. So definitely put your email address in the chat box if you would like to receive that. That's part of our Deconstructing Diversity training, but I'm more than willing to share that free with anybody just because you attended today, since that question came up. So give us your information.
I'm sorry. There are a number of books. I'm looking at them on my shelf. I don't have time to go through them, but I will send those to you and you can share them with your audience, because I'm one of those people, if you have good news, don't keep it to yourself. You share
Exactly.
it with other people.
Absolutely. And that's what we do as well. So sometimes we give away free training just because the information is so powerful that people need to have it in their hands just as an educational tool. So we will do that. Well, Dr. Bell, it has been an amazing discussion. I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart for joining us. I know you've dispelled some of the myths and misconceptions about critical race theory, and you've given us a lot to think about. And the resources and the names that you have shared with us today, people can go from here and do a deeper dive. And that's what we encourage people to do. Our whole goal with disruptive discussion is to open up people's eyes and ears and their hearts and minds.
Do I have time to say one more thing?
You can stay here all day. If it was,
no. The one more thing that I wanted to say is that, so for the audience, they don't know this, that you and I have just met. And
yes.
what is most impressive about you, for me, is your range and the fact that you live in the fullness of your being. And I say that because oftentimes African Americans are very limited. I mean, the perception of us is limited. We're caricatured. And I always say, like, Derrick and I live the fullness of our lives. We laugh, we talk, we dance, we did silly things. And it's important. So you live in 2 countries,
yes.
And that is really amazing to me. And that shows that we are full human beings, and we must continue to embrace that when other people are trying to shrink us and shrink our influence, shrink our creativity, what have you. Don't fall for that.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for that. My parents taught us to be global citizens, and my mother especially, that the world was so much bigger than Kansas City, Missouri, which is where I was born and raised, and to really explore. And I've taken that to heart. My whole family has taken that to heart. So thank you very much for saying that. And I know that you and I will stay connected. I've appreciated the introduction to you, and I also have appreciated the work that you're doing. So I'm buying your books. I'm on Amazon today. I want to encourage anyone else, please go to Amazon, buy her books, especially African American women in the civil rights movement, lighting the fires of freedom. We want to support Dr. Bell because she is an advocate and she is spreading truth and giving truth to power. So thank you everyone for joining us. We will be sending those that have sent us your email information. We'll be sending some resources to you. And please don't forget to follow me on Instagram at d.zenobiaswift, where I try to share inspirational and empowering messages. And additionally, we have recorded this and we will put it on our YouTube channel. So when you give us your information, we will send you the link to that as well. We've enjoyed you sharing with us today, Dr. Bell, and we've enjoyed you, the audience, for coming and talking about critical race theory. We're done for today in disruptive discussion, but you go have a great day. I know, right?